Kenya's central bank says it will continue to intervene in currency markets to smooth out and minimize the volatility in the local currency. Tonight, however, given that the Kenyan shilling is essentially at three-year lows, we'll be asking where do we go from here? Where are the key support points anymore, if any at all, for the Kenyan currency? We'll be answering those questions and plenty more on this edition of Global Business Africa. Here's what's coming up. President Omar Hassan al-Bashir, who's poised to win the elections in Sudan, but what will he do about the economy? And chaotic traffic in South Africa is now creating demand for chauffeurs. We'll tell you why. Now, we're starting here today in Kenya for very good reason. The central bank says it will continue to intervene in currency markets in order to minimize volatility in the exchange rate of the currency as a whole. Now, the Kenyan shilling weakened to a three-year low against the American dollar. At the moment, it's hovering in a fairly tight band around the 92 to 93 shillings to the dollar level. Citigroup says the currency may weaken even further against major currencies as a surge in government spending outruns tax revenue collection. Loose monetary policy and a strong dollar in the global market are both aggravating factors. Now, Kenya currently has foreign exchange reserves equal to well over 4.5 months of imports. Now, in just a moment, we'll be speaking to Konstantin Makarov, the Managing Director of Stratlink Africa. But before that, let's look at three charts that you need to look at if you're going to understand the impact the dollar-shilling rate will have. And we're going to be starting with a question of remittances. Year on year, remittance volumes have actually just consistently gone up, all the way from about 2009. Last year, $1.4 billion was sent into Kenya. That's 10.6% higher than the year before. But this supposedly positive trend notwithstanding, the government's crackdown on hawalas, or trust-based money transfer firms, if you want to use a more formal name, are these volumes really sustainable in the long run? One more thing to be concerned about here, tourism. It's one of Kenya's key foreign exchange earners as well. However, over the last 2 years, the frequency of terror attacks as well as the body count has steadily risen. And that explains the trend that you're seeing here. The yellow line, of course, is 2014. Decline in traffic, 22% year on year, from about 1.1 million all the way to 860,000 last year. Lower tourist traffic translates to less foreign exchange earnings, and that, of course, bodes ill for the dollar-shilling rate, among other matters. We're looking at 20,000 plus in job losses so far. One final thing. Kenya's trade deficit. It's always been a constant source of worry for policymakers. For every 3 shillings we earn from exports, we spend another 7 importing something or other. Year on year, total imports actually grew twice as fast as exports last year. Now, you'll commonly hear one argument around these numbers, mainly that lower oil prices will translate to a lower import bill, and that should therefore provide a significant respite. However, think about it. The magnitude of that relief isn't as large as one would expect. Oil and lubricants as a percentage of total imports fell from a peak of near 25% last year to roughly 16%. Now, we've established that several support pillars to the exchange rate are getting out of shape. So how will the dollar-shilling rate react? Let's find out. Konstantin Makarov is a Managing Director of Stratlink Africa, a research and financial advisory firm. He joins me now live in studio. Mr. Makarov, earlier in April, you argued that you expect the Kenyan shilling to remain in a fairly tight band between 90 and 93 shillings to the dollar in the near term. Do you still stand by that number?
We do. In the short term, we do expect the shilling to hover around the 93 shillings to the dollar mark. In the long term, however, we do see the shilling slowly moving to in the band of 95 to 96. Having said that, that's in the next 6 to 24 month time range. And overall, Kenya does have a very strong macroeconomic picture. I think there is a lot of emphasis on what's happening with the shilling, and not enough attention is being placed on the positive impact and the positive developments of the local economy. Kenya has a whole lot going for it, and I think what we're seeing with the shilling is a combination of both a very strong dollar and a very healthy economy, which is calling for a whole lot of imports to be imported, which has, as you mentioned correctly, an effect on the current account deficits.
Indeed. Let's focus on one of the things, however, that the Kenyan government can and ideally should fix: tourism. We've seen an increase in the frequency and the total fatalities from the attacks that have simply ramped up since 2013. Government's response, however, simply has not kept up. Given the decline in tourist traffic that we've seen, how big a hit should we expect to the dollar shilling rate based on tourist traffic and revenues alone?
I think that the issue of tourism has already been priced into the market. If you look at our models, what we're assuming is a fairly flat earnings from the tourism sector, possibly taking a small dip, but that is already reflected in the market today. I think everybody has accepted that the tourism is a challenge. We see the Kenyan government putting a lot of emphasis on reviving that sector, but for all of our assumptions, we're assuming same levels as the year before.
So just to clarify, in your models, in your analysis, tourist traffic, tourist revenue essentially has bottomed out, more or less?
Correct.
Okay, let's move on to remittances. These have, of course, provided quite a bit of support to the Kenyan shilling in increasing magnitude since 2009. Given what happened on the 7th of April, the shutting down of the accounts for about 13 or 14 hawalas, what effect will that have on the dollar shilling rate as well?
I think there's a short-term effect, and I think there is a overreaction, a short-term knee-jerk reaction to shut down some operators. I think what we're hoping, and we are cautiously optimistic, that some of the same operators will reopen. I think the burden of proof will be on those operators to confirm to the Kenyan government that their activities are completely legitimate, and that once they do that, I'm fairly certain that most of them will be reopened.
Indeed. One final question for you, Mr. Makarov. Between the factors we've discussed here, stronger American dollar, imports are still growing faster than exports, and here we have an economy that signed a standby credit facility with the IMF, but the exchange rate is still essentially heading south. What's the utility of having this facility? Is it providing value for money to the Kenyan economy?
It is. I think it provides the necessary cushion and the necessary emergency fund to draw from if things do go awry and if there is a confluence of unfortunate events. But having said that, I'd like to focus a bit more on the positive side. If you look at most of the major currencies in sub-Saharan Africa, the Kenyan shilling is actually quite strong. We expect it to outperform its peers. If you look at South Africa, the rand has depreciated over 8%. If you're looking at in Nigeria, we're looking at a 20% depreciation. The cedi has fallen almost 10%. So amongst its peers, the Kenyan shilling is quite strong. We anticipate it to, even though it will depreciate, it will outperform in the region.
Indeed. We'll have to leave it there for the time being on a positive note. Konstantin Makarov, Managing Director, Stratlink Africa, there with us in studio. Now, let's take you over to South Africa. The IMF's latest growth projections are likely to make for very uncomfortable reading for those in Africa's second largest economy. And there's a simple reason for that. The growth forecast for South Africa, the latest edition of the World Economic Outlook, have been revised downwards to 2% in 2015 and just 2.1% in 2016. Now, next year's forecast is actually a half-point downgrade compared to the data that the fund put out in January. The cut also comes at a time when the country's GDP growth desperately needs to go up. CCTV's Lorna Shattuck spoke to Laura Pappy, the IMF's mission chief for South Africa, about the country's dismal growth prospects.
We expect some recovery compared to the very low growth rate of 1.5 registered in 2014. But that recovery is expected to be fairly subdued. And the main reason at the moment is that electricity shortages are affecting activity in South Africa, as well as affecting investment.
So what is your advice then for Eskom in particular, and how to deal with those grid reliability issues? What more needs to be done to improve that picture?
So it's a complex issue, and obviously we are not electricity experts. There is a range of interventions that is needed, and they're partly happening. But as the authorities themselves have highlighted, this is a process that will take a couple of years probably until electricity shortages are no longer binding.
And when it comes to industrial relations as well, that's something that South Africa has potentially had some problems with. What is your advice on that score as well?
We think that, of course, industrial relations should improve, and actually we are expecting a lower number of days lost to strikes compared to last year, and that's an important reason behind the expectations for a recovery in 2015.
And when we think about the region as a whole of sub-Saharan Africa, clearly that is one of the fastest growing regions of the world. So why is South Africa not necessarily keeping pace with that region?
We should remember that South Africa is much richer than most of the countries in the region, and hence we would expect that South Africa grows more slowly than some of the poorer countries in Africa. South Africa is also taking advantage to some extent of the fact that the region is growing fast. For example, Sub-Saharan Africa has become the first destination of South Africans' manufacturing products. And also South African firms are expanding in the region. To improve those linkages and deepen those linkages, we would need to see improvements in South Africa's competitiveness, and that's not just a price issue, but it goes back to resolving the electricity shortages and some of the other structural challenges that are keeping South Africa's growth pretty low.
On to Sudan now. Logistical problems have hampered voting at a small number of polling stations in Sudan as voters headed to the polls for the second of 3 days to choose a president and members of parliament. Now, most of the main opposition parties are boycotting these elections entirely, and government critics say there's very little, if any, competition against President Omar Hassan al-Bashir. He has been in power since 1989. Yasser Kim is in Sudan. He now explains what this poll means to the country's economy.
Since the annexation of South Sudan from Sudan in 2011, this has hit the economy hard, and the debt problem increased significantly. It reached $45 billion at one point, 100% of GDP. Now, the government has been in close contact with the World Bank and the IMF, and the Minister of Finance was at the World Bank in Washington weeks ago, where he managed to take a promise from the World Bank to reschedule the debt issue, and also from France and other European countries. Now, at the same time, the World Bank is the one that's been monitoring and giving advice, especially technical advice, to the government for the economic reforms. And much of the economic reforms that took place in the last few months have been based on World Bank advice. And we're talking about reforms such as the reduction of subsidies on energy and oil, on petrol and diesel. And this issue in particular has caused a rise in prices similar to what has happened in Egypt in the last few months, and in 2014, quite similar economic reforms concerning less expenditure or less public expenditure, and this has raised the price and raised inflation. Now, what the government has done to try to counter the inflation problem and the effects of the austerity measures is that, first of all, it has established a large number of public offices and distribution centers in poor areas and poor cities and villages where food and supplies are sold at low prices, as well as the government has given employees, especially public employees, the opportunity to buy goods, basic goods such as sugar, meat, rice, and wheat at low prices, or even to pay in installments. Now, this over a few months' time has managed to cut inflation a bit, to stop the rise of prices further, and to simply also stop the devaluation of the Sudanese pound.
Now, speaking of Sudan, its government is taking steps, as you heard a little earlier from Yasser Kim, to rehabilitate its fractured economy. However, it is getting some help from China and its Arab neighbors. Now, years of insurgency, a split with South Sudan a couple of years ago, and an ongoing trade embargo with the US have all resulted in a lack of investment, a drop in production and limits on exports. The nation's trade deficit actually tripled to $3.3 billion in 2014 compared to 2011. Unemployment levels officially have gone up to 20%.
We signed an initiative for food security proposed by the President and the Saudi monarch, based on the Arab League resolutions. We agreed on starting preparations to implement these initiatives into projects.
Quick run through the markets here for you. Day of red ink right across the board, except, however, for Egypt. The EGX 30 up by just over a third in trading today. Incidentally, I&M, one of the banks listed in Kenya, its Rwandan subsidiary, will be having an IPO. The Rwandese government is selling off its stake of about 19.8% or so. If you're interested, now might be a time to actually check in and snap up some interesting bargains. Coming up next, global investors are bracing for flat season as earnings season comes along. And we'll be looking at the daunting task of transforming the dense suburb of Nima thanks to donor support. Africa is on the move. It's home to 7 of the world's 10 fastest growing economies. We help you make sense of the fast-changing African business landscape. We take you where the business is happening.
Global Business, weekdays at this time on CCTV Africa.
This is the first year that Africa will have more foreign direct investment than aid. And it's like the tipping point in terms of changing the way the continent is perceived. And I think this summit very much responds to that call. Now, whether it can materialize what is being announced is something that we'll have to check and see whether it happens.
Welcome back to the program. About a quarter way into the hour, you're still watching Global Business Africa. Now, investors right across the world are gearing up for earnings season. This week, several global companies will be reporting first quarter earnings, and that ought to provide us with quite a bit of insight, not just into the health of the American economy, but the global one as well. Shreyasi Tandon has more.
U.S. companies such as Intel, JP Morgan, and Wells Fargo are just some of the big names set to kick off the earnings rush this week. But investors and analysts alike are bracing themselves for what is expected to be a flat earnings season.
Strength in the dollar is definitely going to hurt the multinationals because you do business, let's say, in another part of the world. When you translate those monies into dollars, there are less of them. Also, winter. We had a very, very cold winter, especially in the Northeast. I mean, Boston had record amounts of snow. And energy. Believe it or not, energy was both a headwind and a tailwind, which is really exceptional.
It's not just U.S. operations that are going to be affected. Companies doing business in Europe are also going to feel the pinch. Although the Eurozone's economic picture is improving, analysts say the weakening euro against the greenback is cause for concern.
It wasn't really weakness in the economic activity in the Eurozone, but the fact that you had a lower euro that will affect earnings for a lot of these multinationals, and that includes some of the drug companies too.
One of the most closely watched earnings reports this week will be the big banks. Firms such as JP Morgan, Bank of America, Goldman Sachs, and Wells Fargo are going to give market watchers a peek into their balance sheets. Although earnings are expected to be lackluster, experts say the banks are finally in good shape.
I think by and large, your typical bank, it's just so-so. It'll depend on conditions that were in that particular area or, general industries in which they were involved. But generally speaking, their balance sheets, I think, look pretty good at this point.
Other than financial companies, investors are also eagerly awaiting to see just how well some of the tech giants performed in the first quarter. And although analysts are giving a mixed bag of forecasts, they all seem to agree that the internet heavy hitters like Netflix, Google, and Yahoo will all be in the spotlight this week. Shreyasi Tandon, CCTV, New York.
Over in Ghana, the capital city of Accra is set to benefit from a 2-year-long charity project that aims to make the city a lot more resilient to sudden shocks or natural disasters. The Rockefeller Foundation's 100 Resilient Cities scheme aims to help urban centres improve their social, physical and economic infrastructure. Katerina Vitozzi travelled to one community that could benefit from the extra investment. She filed this report.
Musa Swala lives in Nima, a vibrant, diverse community in central Accra.
We have Muslims, we have Christians, we have even traditionalists living in one place without any conflict or any fight.
That diversity, as well as affordable rents, means that Nima has become home to migrants from across Ghana and West Africa. 80,000 people live here, making it one of the capital's most densely populated areas. That brings its own challenges.
We have problem with water and the infrastructure as well. Most of the buildings here are very, very old, and it's made from the sand and the clay. They are not built by the bricks or the blocks. So we also have poor sanitation, like when you look at around the gutters, it's not that good, and anytime people sweep, at times the rubbish ended up in those gutters, and we have a lot of choked gutters around, which is not good for the health of the people living in Nima.
Poor sanitation has been linked to recent outbreaks of cholera. It's something residents and city planners want to do something about, and now there's a good opportunity to do so.
Nima could be one of the communities to benefit from the capital's council teaming up with the US charity, the Rockefeller Foundation. Accra has been named one of the foundation's 100 resilient cities. That means it will receive support and funding to make social and economic improvements to infrastructure in the communities that need it most.
The Rockefeller Foundation wants to help selected cities be more resilient to shocks like sudden migration or natural disasters. Accra was chosen because its Metropolitan Assembly, or AMA, has already got some plans to make communities stronger. In Nima, that means improving the basics to service its growing population.
Some of the plans that the AMA is having for this community is that we are trying to open out the community by providing certain projects which will open the community economically, to make it easier for the people in terms of infrastructure, roads, drainages, and then the housing projects.
Alongside Accra, Arusha in Tanzania, Enugu in Nigeria and Kigali in Rwanda have also been selected as resilient cities. The 2-year projects will be starting in the coming weeks. Katerina Vitozzi, CCTV, Accra.
Now, children in Nigeria's capital of Abuja marched through the streets on Tuesday. Why? They were marking the 1-year anniversary of the mass kidnapping of over 200 schoolgirls by Boko Haram militants. Now, the abduction of these girls from a secondary school in Chibok last year in April drew international attention to the humanitarian crisis caused by this group. Girls and young women wearing T-shirts chanted solidarity songs as they marched to the Ministry of Education office. According to a report by Amnesty International, militants belonging to Boko Haram have kidnapped at least 2,000 girls and women since the start of 2014. More often than not, they turn these individuals into cooks, sex slaves and fighters. And also they kill those who refuse to comply. Sad news indeed. Let's move on to commodity news here for you. Quick run through tea matters. We covered this a little earlier in our conversation around Kenya. Of course, that forms roughly 21% of foreign currency earnings. However, Kenya's had a relatively rough year for its tea sector, and that turns out to have been Burundi's gain. Export earnings in the first quarter from tea were up 52% to just over $8 million from about $5 million in the comparable period in 2014. Chaotic traffic in South Africa has created demand for chauffeurs. We'll be taking a limo ride next.
Africa is not one country.
And Africa is not one story.
But as Africans, we do share one belief.
What more offensive in a
that whatever the challenge, we will overcome.
CCTV Africa brings you unrivaled coverage.
From the fight against Ebola to the fight for greater freedom.
From the figures seeking your vote to the figures shaping your economy.
This is Guy Henderson reporting from the jungles of East.
And all the reasons to celebrate the diversity of life on this great continent.
Welcome back to the program. Now, unreliable transport is forcing more and more South Africans to buy cars. A typical trip from the suburbs to the CBD can be an infuriating 3 hours, and many feel that time is just completely wasted. And in any case, they're actually absolutely right. Now, some businessmen are responding by hiring drivers so that they can put those hours to better use. Sumitra Naidu found this report on the growing chauffeur industry in Johannesburg.
Johannesburg has chronically high traffic volumes. Getting around a city with 2 million vehicles on the road can be quite challenging, especially in peak hour traffic. A single journey can sometimes take between 2 and 3 hours. Business executives are now choosing to be driven.
I spend most of the time in the car. I look after 32 companies. So there is no chance in the 24 hours that I have, if I'm going to spend 8 of that 24 hours driving around, that I'm going to be able to cover what I need to cover.
Lebo Gunguluza is a serial entrepreneur. He is one of South Africa's youngest self-made millionaires. He describes his car as his mobile office.
The time that I spend on the road driving and focusing on the road, and where I literally cannot do anything else, can you imagine how much time is gone? For me, now, if he's driving, I have all the time in the world to do what I need to do. I make the calls, I respond to people, I look at my iPad, I open up my laptop, and I make sure that I cover as much as I can.
Stephen Lenscher has been driving Gunguluza for 6 months now. While it's not an easy job, he feels it's an important one.
It opens your mind, you know, more especially for me, purely as I want to be an entrepreneur. So I will say I'm on a right path because I get to interact with Mr. Lebo Gunguluza, with what he does. You know, it's really uplifting my philosophy and my passion.
While driving, he's also receiving valuable mentorship from Gunguluza in order to expand on his own business ideas.
I said to him, his passion must be used. He must transfer information to the other younger generation by training other younger people to also become drivers so they can drive my other executives, my other entrepreneurs around, because I don't want my entrepreneurs to spend too much time on the road just not being productive.
Being stuck in traffic leads to lost productivity. It's also rather frustrating to arrive at work tired, only to spend a few hours and then get back onto the road into afternoon peak time traffic. Chauffeur-driven services are becoming increasingly popular. Companies too are looking at providing transport services for their staff. Sumitra Naidu, CCTV, Johannesburg.
Of course, we did spend the entire first part of this bulletin, the first 10 minutes or so, talking about the Kenyan shilling. So it's only fair that now we focus on the rand. It was up about 1 percentage point or so in trading today against the American dollar. We'll keep tabs on these numbers for you, of course, as we always do right here on Global Business. Here's what we're working on for tomorrow's edition of the program. The World Travel Market opens in Cape Town, South Africa. 2 operators from right across Africa will be represented, including Kenya. They'll be looking to boost the tourism sector and change perceptions around it. It's currently been decimated by a string of terrorism attacks. Zimbabwe's government has suspended bonuses for civil servants. Obviously, they need to cut expenditure quite a bit. To what extent this will give them some breathing room, we'll find out later on tomorrow. That's it for this edition of the program. Thank you so much for watching. We always like hearing your feedback on what we do around here. Global Business Africa at cctv.com is your email address. And of course, Facebook and Twitter are also your ports of call. We'll see you right here tomorrow. I'm Ramanyang. Thank you for watching.